Hi guys, so this is AP World History, Chapter 3, Early African Societies and Bantu Migrations. So today is really going to be about Egypt and Nubia. And Egypt was one of the other river valley civilizations that was around during the time of Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia was the other river valley civilization that we looked at last chapter. Today we're going to look at Egypt and Nubia. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing we're going to look at is how Egypt essentially came to be in terms of its natural environment. So the early agricultural society in Africa, and it really starts with climate change. So Egypt wasn't the way it always is today. There was actually a climate shift that occurred. This is the area obviously we're looking at, just in case you don't know where Egypt is. It's right here, nestled between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea and connects to the Middle East. So after about 5000 BCE, there was a profound climate change. And this climate change was so profound that pretty much it created a desert around Egypt, and it forced people to have to find another way to survive, and it influenced social organization and agriculture in the region. Things were hotter and drier. There was more desiccation that was occurring. So what ends up happening is people will have to move towards bodies of water in order to survive. And the bodies of water that are there are Lake Chad and the Nile. So this is an image of the Nile River. Definitely not like any river that we have in our area. It's the world's longest river, and it floods and it recedes, creating a rich, fertile soil. So you can see here how it's covering some of the land through the flooding, and then it will go back and recede to its normal state. So just so you know, this map shows pretty much the area we're talking about. I'm going to say Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt a lot. So what you need to know is that Lower Egypt is actually in the north, and Upper Egypt is actually in the south, and then Nubia is right below Upper Egypt, just so you can kind of understand what I'm talking about. So Egypt and Nubia, they're around the same time period. And again, you're going to hear me talk about these two areas together. So they really did influence each other, and we see that they both use the Nile. So the Nile is going to link the Mediterranean basin in the north and the sub-Saharan Africa in the south. So it's going to, it pretty much goes all down Africa. Like I said, Egypt and Nubia, they'll influence each other, and they're both going to rely on the Nile for agriculture, but they're going to rely on it in different ways. For the Egyptians, what begins to happen is they're going to cultivate in the summer, and then they'll harvest whatever they cultivated in winter and early spring. And really, they don't have to do any preparation for their land. Again, the way it said, the Nile would flood and recede. However, in Nubia, it was different. Nubia relied on prepared fields and irrigation systems to bring in the water. And Egypt, it will become more intense in agriculture as the population grows. They'll realize, like, okay, we can't just rely on the flooding and receding. We also are going to need to prepare our irrigation systems in our lands and have dikes and basins to control the flow of the water. In terms of political organization, there was this formal organization very similar to the way you saw it in Mesopotamia, where you had that stratified society. And of course, it's there to maintain order. And like any government, it's also there to organize community projects. And in terms of authority, power came from divine authority, also known as a theocracy. So it's really important that you understand that word, a theocracy. Okay, it's the idea that God is giving you the power to rule, or that your people see you as a god. So you can see right here, this is kind of the social structure that existed in Egypt. We have the pharaoh, the government officials, nobles, priests, soldiers, scribes, merchants, craftsmen, and then farmers, slaves at the very bottom. So your first discussion question, why did Nubia and Egypt need to have different approaches for the use of the Nile? The next thing we're going to look at is the unification of Egypt. So before there was obviously unification, Egypt was not one unified civilization. There were two parts to it. There was Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, and it really is Menes. This is a sculpture of the pharaoh Menes. He was the one that unified it. So again, here was Lower Egypt and then Upper Egypt, and then he'll come along and bring them together. And when he does this, Memphis will be the capital for the unified Egypt, and it's going to be the cultural and political center of kind of the Egyptian civilization. And similar to that of Mesopotamia, there was a centralized state. Rule was with a pharaoh, also known as the Egyptian king. So the way they call their kings are pharaohs. And it was thought that they were the gods living on earth. And the pharaoh had absolute power. He was considered the owner and ruler of the land. And then this is kind of how the pharaoh looked, or the headpiece he wore when it was just Upper Egypt, and then when it was Lower Egypt, and when he united them both, he put both of these together. So Egypt has three time frames that it kind of splits up. The first is the Old Kingdom. The other is the Middle and the New Kingdom. So the first one we're going to look at is the Old Kingdom. So what you need to know in the Old Kingdom is that the Pharaoh had great power, and he was really seen as this absolute ruler. And this was a time when they made massive constructions to honor the Pharaoh. And one of the larger constructions they did were the pyramids that you see here. And it really showed the ability to marshal resources, to get 84,000 people together to work continuously on this project. So Khufu's pyramid is the largest pyramid, all right, and then there are smaller pyramids below it. And like I said, it took about 80,000 laborers to construct the pyramid. In terms of relationships between Egypt and Nubia, they both had a strong interest in each other, and both pretty much for the same reasons, for political and commercial reasons. Egypt, they felt threatened by Nubian kingdoms, so they wanted their products. They wanted to build that commercial relationship, so then they would feel that the Nubians didn't have a reason to attack them. And similarly with the Nubians as well. The Egyptians wanted their gold, their ivory. This is pretty much what they think the Nubian kingdom may have looked like. And the Nubians, they saw that Egypt was this massive, civilization, and they were also worried that, the Egyptians would come in and take over them. So again, you had this similar interest in each other and preventing each other from taking control of one another. So the early kingdom of Kush, this is a map of the early kingdom of Kush. This is Kush right here. There was frequent violence during this old kingdom time period, and for a while Egypt will come in and dominate Lower Nubia. So the Egyptian presence led to political organization in Upper Nubia, and what ends up happening is that the Nubians will go further down south where they don't feel as threatened by the Egyptians, and they'll establish the kingdom of Kush. Though the relationship is tense between the Egyptians, there was alliances and diplomacy that existed. And you need to think about, why would these things exist? Why would alliances exist? Why would diplomacy exist? Why would even intermarriage exist? There's an important reason for it. So your second and third questions: why do you think tension existed between Egypt and Nubia? And why was it smart to have intermarriage between the two? How effective do you think this was? So that pretty much covers the first part of Egypt, the Old Kingdom. When we look at the Middle Kingdom, we're going to see more turmoil in the empire, and it really starts with the Hyksos. And the Hyksos are riding nomads, and they believe to have been from Indo-European descent. And this is what's happening during the Middle Kingdom in Egypt. And what ends up happening is the Hyksos will invade Egypt, and they'll take over Egypt for a time. This is what they believe the Hyksos looked like, a sculpture. So the Hyksos are going to introduce the horse-drawn chariot into Egypt, and they're also going to introduce the idea of bronze for weapons and bows, because at this time Egypt is just using wooden arrows and wooden weaponry. So, this advancement for them to come in is like something they've never seen, and of course it would make sense why they got taken over. And this is just kind of some of the way they would dress back then for war. So Upper Egypt would organize revolts using Hyksos weaponry, and that's what ends up happening is that a lot of the Egyptians were obviously very upset that they had foreigners coming in and taking over. So they began to use the foreigners' weapons against them. They began to use that bronze against the Hyksos. They began to use those chariots against the Hyksos, and that's really what was able to drive the Hyksos out and end this Middle Kingdom time period. So after the Middle Kingdom, we see the New Kingdom that arrives. And the New Kingdom is full of prosperity and very productive. They're, accumulating more wealth. They have better agricultural surplus. Their army and their bureaucracy is stronger. It's more bureaucratic, more government organized. The responsibilities in the bureaucracy are divided between the court, a treasury, and religious cults. This is kind of the map just so you can see the Old, Middle, and New Kingdom and the expansions that they had. So this would be like their main area that they were in charge of, and then the green is the influence that they had around their area. So you can see in the New Kingdom, it really, really expanded their influence. So this kind of leads into the idea of Egyptian imperialism. They wanted to extend their authority to surrounding areas. And again, as you see in the Middle Kingdom, they really expanded their influence around their region. And they just didn't want to happen what happened in the Middle Kingdom again. They wanted to make sure that whoever was around them, they were influencing them enough to the point where they would not want to try and attack them. So power over the Eastern Mediterranean Basin, Southwest Asia, as well as the Nile River Valley is really what they had influence in. And Egypt was driven out from Nubia and Southwest Asia by the end of this Egyptian imperialism. So we'll see also the revived kingdom of Kush. Egypt will retreat from Nubia because Nubia will gain strength and they will be able to push out Egypt. And for a time, a short amount of time, they will actually dominate Egypt for about a century. It's not very long in the scope of things, but there was that dominance there. And Egypt invaded from both sides by Kushites and Assyrian army. And that's really what weakened them. So here's the kingdom of Kush that you see, the brown section. Okay, questions 4 and 5. How would Egyptian society been different had the Hyksos never invaded? And create a Venn diagram between the Old Kingdom and the New Kingdom of Egypt. Okay, so your takeaways here for this section are pretty much how Egypt united, the influence that the Nile had in terms of Egypt becoming a large civilization, knowing that in the Old Kingdom you had massive monuments being built to honor the pharaohs. The Middle Kingdom, you see the Hyksos coming in and invading and taking over, foreigners taking over. However, the Egyptian will use the foreign technology that's brought in order to kick out those foreigners. The New Kingdom, you're going to see a lot of prosperity. They're not going to make these huge monuments the way they did in terms of the pyramids, but they will have nicer palaces, nicer temples that occur. And you also need to definitely know that Nubia was right there alongside Egypt, and they both influence each other heavily. Okay, so next time we're going to look at the complex societies of Egypt and their cultural traditions.